Good evening. I'm Paul Fredette.
And I'm Karen Fredette.
Some 17 years ago, Karen and I began Raven's Bread Ministries as a way of trying to serve the needs of hermits and religious solitaries around the world. Before we moved here to our home in the mountains of western North Carolina, from where we conduct Raven's Bread Ministries, Karen had lived as a hermit, and before that, as a poor Clare sister. And during that time, she had written a book entitled Clare, Her Light and Her Song, about the life and times of Clare of Assisi. Well, back in the spring of this year, Brother Sean Bradley invited us very graciously to participate in the efforts of the Interfaith Franciscan community by offering weekly presentations here on the Doves for Peace channel. So since March, it's been our real privilege and our pleasure to be able to offer some of our reflections from our years of ministering to hermits and religious solitaries, and most recently in particular to tell the story of Clare of Assisi, a 12th century woman who was very much ahead of her own time and whom Karen and I believe is very much a woman for our own time.
Yes.
Certainly an inspiration, a challenge, really an indomitable figure whose determination and whose authentic devotion and commitment to gospel life was heroic then and is certainly would be considered heroic today. Of course, we can't tell the story of Clare of Assisi without at the same time telling the story of Francis of Assisi.
Francis, her great friend, her soulmate, her father in God, and the person on earth that I think she loved more than anyone else.
When we tell the story of Francis and Clare, as we have been, and we speak about their relationship, and we're going to continue to speak about that relationship today, but at this point in our story, Clare and Francis' relationship is beginning to change. The initial days, the days of joy, and not that the joy is over, but they are beginning, as do all great relationships, have their ups and downs. And one of the first big challenges and problematic times for Clare and for Francis was the death of Pope Innocent III, their great friend, their great supporter, and their inspiration in terms of his own reform-mindedness for the church. Well, we pick up our story today on Clare's 22nd birthday. She's been at San Damiano now for 4 years.
Mm-hmm.
And on July the 16th, her birthday, in nearby Perugia, very unexpectedly, Pope Innocent III dies. He was only 56 years old, and at the time of, and seemingly in robust health. If you remember, Pope Innocent was the one who had received Francis in Rome and had given him permission to preach and had sanctioned his way of life. Pope Innocent was nearby in Perugia at this time. And as we've just said, he died rather unexpectedly. Part of the tragedy of his death is that the night before his funeral rites were to take place, his body laid in state in the Cathedral of Perugia, and during the night, thieves broke in and completely stole everything, stole his vestments, stole all of the insignia, papal insignia, everything that he had about him. They trashed the place, and they left the Pope's body, mostly naked, laying on the floor of the cathedral. Well, the next morning, as people entered the cathedral, they were horrified at the sight, and legend has it that Francis himself was there, had been there at the death of Innocent III, and when he saw the condition of the Pope's body, he removed his own rough, simple tunic, and he covered the Pope's body with it. In those days, electing a new Pope took quite a bit of time, and sometimes even years. But the populace of Perugia was in no mood to let this happen at this time. There were so many dangerous and delicate political situations afoot on the Italian peninsula and in Europe as a whole during those times that the populace of Perugia decided that they were going to take matters into their own hands, and they quickly ushered all of the cardinal electors who were then present in Perugia, into an enclosure and locked the doors. It is the first instance of what we have come to know as the papal conclave. Conclave in Latin meaning with a key, that the electors were locked in. And they were informed that for every day that passed without their having successfully elected a new pontiff, their ration of foods would be diminished.
Now that doesn't probably apply to the conclave that we just all read about in the early spring of this year, but that does give you an idea of the impatience of the people and their ability to take things into their own hands.
Well, it was almost a record time for electing a new pope, because within 2 days, Honorius III, a well-known prelate of the day, a member of the Curia, but a very elderly man, and probably, Karen, that this was an attempt at an interim pope until the prelates had a more extensive time to deliberate about who they might want.
Well, that would seem to have been the intention, but Honorius surprised them by living 11 vigorous years on the papal throne, following up on Innocent's plan of reform for the church.
Right. And while Francis and Clare were indeed sorrowful over the loss of their great friend, Innocent III, they lost no time, either one of them, deepening the bonds of affection between themselves and the new pope, Honorius III. And Karen, maybe you could relate how Francis initially came to really deepen this relationship with Honorius, who was, as you say, very much in the same reform-mindedness as Innocent III was at the time.
Honorius was still in Perugia when Francis had a great dream. It was a very significant dream to him. He dreamt that he saw Christ Jesus with his Blessed Mother in heavenly glory. And they told Francis that he was to go to the Pope and get from him the great indulgence or pardon that was usually granted only to people who went on crusade or a
Well, actually,
pilgrimage
pilgrimage to
to
the
the
Holy
Holy
Land.
Land. Yes, Crusaders got this also,
Hmm.
which meant that all their sins, once confessed, were totally forgiven, and any punishment still due to them would be totally remitted.
Hmm.
They
Now,
could die and go straight to heaven.
right. And those of us now looking at it from the perspective, looking back at the Middle Ages from our position in the 21st century, whatever our changed perspectives might be about the value of the Crusades or their lasting impact in history, political history, or whatever we might think about the controversies that ensued during the High Middle Ages and the Renaissance and then into the Reformation period over indulgences and the abuse of indulgences and even the theology that underpins indulgences. For Francis, for Clare, for Honorius, and for the people of Europe at that time, this was a tremendous, tremendous boost and motivator to reform lives and to become more, to become converted to the gospel.
Yeah, what we are told is that a couple weeks after Honorius was elected, Francis comes striding into the gathering where Honorius is sitting, and he says, I come to you with a message from Jesus Christ himself, which I suppose is enough to set anybody back on their heels, and said that Jesus has told me to ask you to grant everyone who visits the chapel of Our Lady of the Angels the same indulgence of their sins and punishment as those who go on crusade.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this assumes that people are repentant, they have confessed their sins, but there is no mention of money. This is something that they will receive simply by visiting that little chapel.
Mm-hmm. And confessing themselves and trying to reform their lives.
Well, Honorius saw the value of this, but he decided that it should be limited. So it was available to people only on one day of the year, the feast of the dedication of Our Lady of the Angels. And as a result, that particular day became a day of great processions of people pouring in to Assisi and surrounding areas in order to go into that little chapel and say their prayers on that particular day. I myself was there back in about 1994
Mm-hmm.
and felt the pressure of the crowds there because people still do come. This is still a day of great pilgrimage. And I was swept from the back of the chapel right up to the steps of the sanctuary with no real movement on my part. I experienced the enthusiasm of the people. It was breathless.
Some of that can even be caught in this medieval illustration of Francis declaring the great pardon which is in his hand. And as you can see, to the viewers left of Francis are the assembled prelates, and down below are the various knights and the people, all in a big crowd, attentively listening to Francis proclaim the great pardon as it was come to be known.
And his words were, I want to send you all to paradise. And then he explained what they needed to do. And this has lived on. As I said, it's still in existence today.
Now, one of the things that we have to look at as we look at this juncture in the story of Clare is that there was a great deal, this is the High Middle Ages, and there was a great deal of vice and corruption in the church. The wealth of a lot of prelates, their absences, their sumptuous way of life and their absences, and the lack of preaching that was going on. This was a terrible indictment to what had developed from out of the feudal church, and a lot of people were scandalized. There was one rather famous, to history, French prelate, Jacques de Vitry, who had just been appointed a bishop and was coming to the Pope for his episcopal consecration when Innocent III died. So he was there during all of these proceedings, when Honorius was elected and when Francis came to see Honorius, and he wrote down all his reflections of what he saw in that area of the Valley of Spoleto and where Perugia was and everything, and what he saw of the papal court, and he talked about the corruption, but he also said this, and Karen and I would like to share this exact quote with you from Jacques de Vitry's recollections. He said, "In the midst of all this corruption, I nonetheless found consolation in seeing great numbers of men and women who renounced all their possessions and left the world for the love of Christ. Friars minor and sisters minor, as they are called. They are held in great esteem by the Lord Pope and the cardinals. They are totally detached from temporal things and have but one passion, to which they devote all their efforts: to snatch from the vanities of the world souls that are in danger, and to prevail upon them to imitate their example. Thanks to God, they've already achieved important successes and made numerous conquests. Those who have heard them say to their friends, 'Come along,' and so one group brings another. As for the brothers themselves, they live the life of the primitive church, of which it is written, 'The whole group of believers was united in heart and soul.' During the day, these men go into the cities and villages, giving themselves over to the active life of the apostolate, in other words, the preaching. At night, they return to their individual hermitages and withdraw into solitude to live the contemplative life. The women live near the cities in various hospices and other refuges. They live a community life from the work of their hands, but accept no income. The veneration that the clergy and the laity show toward them is a burden to them, and it chagrins and annoys them." We have to remember that at this time, the Franciscan experience, if you want, Francis and his male followers, and Francis and Clare and the female followers, the poor ladies, are not really religious orders at this time. They are more of a lay movement that is loosely organized and loosely structured. There are no really hard and fast regulations. They have a forma vitae, a way of life, but they don't have much beyond that, right, Claire? Karen?
No, at this, Francis is never an administrator. I mean, people can be saints without being perfect individuals in all of their aspects. And one of Francis' weaknesses was that of an administrator. He simply felt that if people fell in love with Jesus, the Jesus that he saw, and chose to live poverty, they would do so. And there was no need to write much more.
So he was not a community organizer.
No, he was not. And Clare had struggled quite a bit to get even a few written words from him for the poor ladies. Mm-hmm. But as Paul said, this was a lay movement, and we can hardly imagine the excitement the enthusiasm that was moving through the church. This was a moment, a watershed moment in the life of the church. And we'll see more of that as time goes on. But we have Clare.
But you're right.
Go
And
on.
I was going to say, just as Francis had his weaknesses or maybe areas that were underdeveloped in the way of organization and structure and administration. I mean, the man was a visionary and he was on fire with his vision. But in a sense, so was Clare. But Clare also had her own difficulties and shortcomings, and one of them was the excesses of her devotion.
Yes, Clare was one of these people who was all or nothing. And one of the ways that she felt the poor ladies would sustain and with prayer and penance the work of the brothers was by fasting. Fasting was a very common thing in the Middle Ages, but Clare carried it to an extent. She would go, her sisters said, 3 days out of the week without eating anything. And then on the days when she did eat, she would have a little bread and water, very little else. Well, this might go on for a few months, but as it turned into years, and Clare's devotion just carried her through, she was hardly aware of what she was doing to her body, but her sisters were. They were deeply worried about her. And so they went finally, when Clare wouldn't listen to them, they went to Bishop Guido, who had taken such a fatherly interest in her, and said, do something. Clare's killing herself, literally. And Guido went to Francis, and he said, literally, she's your baby. You drew her. It is up to you to limit her fasting and her going beyond and above what human nature can sustain. So Francis went to visit the poor ladies, which he wasn't doing as frequently as he used to, and perhaps for the first time he noticed that Clare was rather pale. The roses in her cheek had long since faded. She looked thin, tired. And he realized that what he'd heard was true. So he did what he knew he could do. He said to Clare, I am putting you under obedience to me, that you are never to pass another day without eating. And you are to limit your fasting in all regards. To give you an example of what I mean, you must eat at least half a roll. Bread was baked in small rolls in those days and just broken in pieces. A half roll was about 1.5 ounces of bread, if we got our information correctly. And Clare was not to pass a day without eating at least that much. And the sisters said that that was all it took. Anytime that Clare was in prayer throughout the day and had not eaten, the sisters could say to her, remember, Clare, what Francis said, and you must eat at least this bread. It would bring Clare even out of a state of ecstasy. She immediately, cheerfully ate what she knew was Francis' desire for her. If she couldn't moderate herself, at least she was willing to accept the guidance of her Father in Christ.
Well, in the spring, the late spring of 1217, Honorius is now occupying the chair of Peter. Francis has had his little tete-a-tete with Clare about her fasting, and if she had begun to recover, and if perchance she had stood on that little terrace that we showed you earlier called Clare's Garden, that kind of was up above, and she could look out from there onto the Umbrian Valley, if she could have looked out on this scene, which is one that we see today, but if she could have looked out on that expanse, she would have seen a remarkable sight, because Francis had invited all of the friars to join together, to gather together at Pentecost, right there in Assisi. And we don't know if this was the first time they did this, but the numbers on this occasion were remarkable. Friars came from all over, and there were estimates that said anywhere from 700 or 800 to nearly 2,000 friars at this time. And the sight was so remarkable that one of the prelates, a man whom we shall speak of a lot more as we move along, Cardinal Ugolino, who was in a special way, as Bishop of Ostia, Innocent III had asked him to be, in many ways, a special protector to Francis and his friars. And he went out there to see this remarkable sight, and he went back and told the court, the papal court, and the Pope, who was then residing at Perugia nearby, the sight of all of these men who were gathering on the plains there in the valley and sitting in groups of 50, 100, 200, whatever, and so quietly and so humbly that not a sound was heard. It was such a prayerful gathering. Well, it was so amazing that people from everywhere came to see the friars. And we have this
kind of old
illustration of the friars in procession, all coming to the city of Assisi to gather for this Pentecost gathering in 1217. Now, as usual, and this is again part of who Francis is, Francis calls all the friars to come together and at the same time makes absolutely no provision for their sustenance.
No.
So no provisions for food, no provisions for accommodations, nothing at all. Well, the townspeople of the surrounding towns and the men of the papal court and all the attendants, all of these people are so impressed with the demeanor of these friars that they all come and actually wait on the friars. They come and serve them.
They bring food, they bring tableware, they bring things
drinking
to make
vessels, they bring...
Yeah, I mean, they bring everything that the friars will need. And Francis knew that God would provide. This is the way he drove everybody else crazy.
Yeah.
But, you know, God did provide and continued to provide everything. And not only did these people from the court observe this, they got down and began serving the friars themselves, which is quite amazing.
Now, two other things are going on here at the chapter that we would like to mention because they do have a bearing on Clare's story as well. Although Francis really doesn't have much of a head for the practical matters of how you're going to live, where you're going to sleep, what are you going to wear. Francis is not bothered with that. But at least at this point, it's at this chapter that he does realize that a way of life, a form of vitae, if you want, that was acceptable and adequate for a dozen, 2 dozen, 3 dozen followers was simply inadequate for thousands of followers, that this simply would not do. And he had to begin, and it was at this chapter that he decided, yes, that some kind of rule would be written, a little bit more specific, but that he divided the order, he divided the group into geographical provinces. This was the first time. And he appointed people in charge. However, in the spirit of Francis, who was very much very much concerned about the equality of the brotherhood. He didn't even want to be superior himself. He was very much concerned about maintaining the equality of the brotherhood. And so the idea of appointing men as priors or abbots or all of these kinds of superior titles which denoted power and rank, he would have none of. And he purposefully chose to call the people in charge ministers, custodians, guardians. They were there to preserve the family, preserve the way of life. And this spills over with Clare as well.
Well, Clare was, every time she wrote of herself, she always spoke of herself as handmaid and servant of the poor ladies. And those same terms spilled over into the groups that followed her way of life. I hesitate to say rule, because at this time, although both friars and sisters are growing, there is not much of an adequate rule in either one of them.
So it's also at this Pentecost gathering, the last really important thing about this gathering is that Francis not only divides the group into geographical areas, but then, in the spirit again of that original missionary mandate of the gospel that set him afire at St. Mary of the Angels early on, he asked for volunteers to go beyond the Alps. He asked for friars who will volunteer. He's not going to send anybody who doesn't volunteer, but he's going to ask for volunteers to go beyond the Alps into Europe to carry the message, to preach the gospel. And in the spirit of the literal missionary mandate in the gospel, he sends them without any provisions whatsoever, and not even with any written testimonials or written authorizations to preach. Here is where the prelates and the officers of the officials of the church felt he crossed the line between gospel foolishness, if you want, and absolute foolhardiness. And they rebuked him and upbraided him for this, and Francis risked actual, not only censure, but actual suppression of himself and his followers, had it not been for the interventions of this Cardinal Ugolino, who had been a friend and had been actually appointed. It seems to be that he was appointed to be both a protector to the new mendicant groups, the Dominicans and the Franciscans. And here is a very old print of Cardinal Ugolino sitting and in conversation with both Francis in the center and Dominic on the right. What we do know is, although Francis had a good relationship with Ugolino and a warm and affectionate one, that there may have been some strains at this point, because the friars actually did get into trouble going across the Alps into strange territory without any provisions, but especially without any kind of written authorization to preach. We have to remember that Europe at this time is experiencing all these small groups of heretical groups. They may be reform-minded, but they've crossed over the bounds and they're actually perceived as heretics. And Francis's ragtag group of followers really did not impress a whole lot of people, and they were easily mistaken for bands of crazed heretics, and they were either put in prison or threatened with execution. So Cardinal Ugolino, the relationship between Francis and Ugolino and the officials of the church at this point is developing and is experiencing some rough times.
Well, there's strains there.
Yeah.
Now, this is interesting. What is going to happen, I'm just going to mention now. Cardinal Ugolino has already mentioned to Francis that you have to come up with a rule. He has been appointed as the cardinal protector of the poor ladies, and he genuinely respects Clare. He has great reverence for her, and he does a few things, some of which please Clare, some others do not. One of the things he did when he looked at the life of the poor ladies and how there were groups coming up here and there and everywhere, actually, that he exempted them from the jurisdiction of the local bishop and put them under just the jurisdiction of the Pope. In that way, no bishop could interfere with the lives of the poor ladies, and that was a plus. That was generally something that Clare wanted to have happen. The other thing that Cardinal Ugolino did is he looked at the Forma Vitae and the few other writings that Clare based her life on, and he said, this is not enough. And he wrote a rule for Clare.
Right. Well, he was a canonist.
He was a canonist. This is where his mind would go. This was a lack he saw.
He was a canonist, but we have to remember, too, that Ugolino was a deeply spiritual man. And, you know, he was the dean of the College of Cardinals and all of that, but he was also very generous. He gave a lot of his personal revenues to the poor. He really had a deep affection and tender regard for both Francis and Clare and what they were doing. He was very much a kindred spirit, despite being a very high up prelate.
Well, this is where I would have loved to have been, what would you call it, little fly on the wall, when Ugolino comes in and hands Clare a rule. It's basically a Benedictine rule, and has all of the prescriptions that for daily life that's found in the Benedictine rule, which Clare had no quibble with. But well, actually, it was not in that rule.
Yeah, she might have found it a little bit irritating, but she could live with all that. It's not what was in the rule that was so much a bother. It's what was not in the rule.
What was not in the rule. Yes. First of all, it made absolutely no mention of Francis or the dependence of the poor ladies on the Francis or the friars
for their spiritual guidance.
Yeah, I mean, this was, you know, a number one in Clare's mind. This is because they were to nourish, they were the only ones that understood the life they were living. Who else could preach to her sisters better than the friars? And here they're being cut out of the picture
completely. And
the other thing was, Ugolino assumes and makes it very clear in the rule that they will own property, that they will have income from property that they own. And if you remember from earlier broadcasts, Clare had already obtained the privilege of poverty, which ensured that no one had the right to give them property. So Clare, and Clare was a gifted woman in many ways, and I would have loved to have been there when she sat down with Ugolino and said, thank you, but no thank you for this rule.
And we really don't know how they actually worked it out. Both of them were very gracious people, and their demeanors were very gentle. Both Ugolino as well as Clare. We've already talked about Clare's, but Ugolino was a real diplomat, and he had a very fatherly affection for Clare and a deep respect, and a really honest, authentic admiration for her spirituality and her life. He really did. So we're sure they worked it out somehow.
Well, we know for sure that the privilege of poverty, Clare ended up with the permission to continue living as she had been there at San Damiano. And a few of the other monasteries that stayed in close touch with San Damiano were able to do the same. But the majority of them ended up under the Benedictine rule with the right to own property.
Right.
The thing that broke Clare's heart the most, though, was that Frances had stepped aside as her superior.
Right.
And she now was the foundress and leader of the Poor Ladies.
Right. Because now, as we've said, Frances had told her that she had to accept the title of abbess. And now, with the writing of this rule and Ugolino's protection and care, Francis stepped even further. And he was actually in no position to help Clare much at this point because Ugolino was putting pressure on Francis to write his own rule. He would not write the rule for the friars. This was, again, as Karen has pointed out, there's a difference between the way the men and the women religious in the church are relating. A woman could not write a rule.
Oh, no.
At least not until now. A woman could not write a rule. Of course, before Clare's day is over, this will have changed. But at the moment, men write their own rules, but men also write the rules for the women. And right now, Francis was being pressured to write a rule for the friars. Even though he couldn't offer Clare any serious assistance with this, he never flagged in his love, in his care, in his anxiety, thoughts, and prayers for Clare. And there's this one lovely story that at about this time, while he was far from Assisi and on the road in the company of Brother Leo, he, on a given day, was very much overwhelmed, distracted, preoccupied with worry and anxiety, feeling somehow deep within himself that there was something terribly wrong with Clare, that something had happened, that she had somehow either spiritually or emotionally she was bereft, or that she was being pressured and overwhelmed to compromise the commitment to absolute poverty. He was just totally anxious about all of this and demoralized with this. And at the end of the day, it was already nightfall. They came to apparently the entrance of a village where there was a well, and Francis stepped up to the well and gazed down into the well for a long, long time. And finally, when he stepped back from the well, his countenance was absolutely radiant. He was joy-filled again. His demeanor was light, and he said to Brother Leo, "Do you know what I saw in the well?" And all Brother Leo could think of was to say, "Well, you saw the reflection of Sister Moon, who is
directly overhead
right now." And he said, "No, I saw our Sister Clare, and she's at peace, and she's fine. And so now my peace has returned, and I can sing the praises of God, because Clare is at peace in his well." So they were truly soulmates, and even though they no longer saw each other very frequently, and they no longer had much to do with each other's lives, and certainly Francis did not have much to do with directing Clare's life or the life of the poor ladies that were living with her at San Damiano.
Right. Things were happening now. But another way of showing Francis' reverence for Clare and her holiness was when Brother Francis was at Our Lady of the Angels, one of the brothers, Brother Stefano, got very ill. In fact, he apparently lost his mental balance altogether.
For whatever reason, that the word insanity was used, he was just insane, maybe psychotic, we don't know. He just totally lost his mental health. And
Francis simply said, "Take Brother Stefano to Sister Clare." And when they did, Clare made the sign of the cross on his forehead and whispered a little prayer. And then Stefano was given a chance to sleep in the area of the choir where Clare often prayed. So the sisters just left him resting there. When he wakened They gave him a little food, and he was perfectly fine.
Mm-hmm.
This healing gift of Clare was known throughout the monastery, and the sisters themselves spoke often of it
Mm-hmm.
after her death. Many of them had benefited from it directly themselves. And I was a little amused by what one of them said. They said that Clare would make the sign of the cross and would whisper this little prayer so quietly they could never quite make out what she said.
Mm-hmm.
But they tried.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought that was rather amusing that they wanted to know what she said.
Maybe the greatest strain during this period in Clare's life was not even having to accept the title of abbess, or even the gradual distancing of Francis's involvement, direct involvement with the poor ladies at San Damiano. The greatest strain came in her relationship with her very own sister Agnes. And Karen, tell us about how that developed.
Well, Agnes and Clare were very close in age. They'd grown up together in the same household. Clare, when she ran away to join Francis, was less than 2 weeks before Agnes came and joined her. She shared her spiritual ideals and was always with Clare. She looked after Clare when Clare was ill. She was probably one of the most vocal in trying to admonish Clare in her, to modify her fastings. But this was a time when new monasteries were being founded, and there was a community at Monticello. It was probably a Benedictine community that wanted to adopt the way of life at was being lived at San Damiano. And Clare and Agnes were told that Francis wished Agnes to go to Monticello and instruct the sisters there with the way of life of the sisters at San Damiano. Now, we don't know too much about Agnes' personality, but we can surmise that she may well have had more administrative skills than Clare herself had.
Right.
Because this would not be the only community that she was sent to reorganize.
Mm-hmm.
And that takes a great deal of skill right there. But the other thing we know about Agnes was her deeply loving heart.
Mm-hmm.
Clare and Agnes must have exchanged letters as frequently as they could. In those days, letters probably would have been carried by the friars from one community to another whenever it was possible or convenient. And all the letters that Clare wrote to Agnes are no longer extant. But we do have what I felt like when I read it for the first time, a tear-stained letter from Agnes to Clare. She writes, "Dearest sister in Christ, from that hour when the necessity of returning separated me from your holy conversation and tore me away from the joy of heavenly treasures, such bitterness of soul has overcome me, such abundance of tears and cruelty of sorrow, that unless I found solace at the feet of Jesus, I fear I would have fallen into such straits, my spirits would have fainted away, and my soul have melted within me." You hear echoes of biblical terminology,
Mm-hmm.
because that was what they studied. They knew it as well as they knew their own language.
Mm-hmm.
Writing was all writing was done in Latin in those days, so the scriptures were taught to them in Latin.
Mm-hmm.
So Agnes also wrote that she had believed that people who were one heart and one soul would always be together. And she says with heartbreaking simplicity, "I realize I was mistaken." She and Clare were separated and would be separated for almost the entire term of Clare's life.
Mm-hmm.
Agnes would go from one monastery to another. And
And
these
was
two,
really, in a way, although Clare is the foundress of the Poor Ladies, it seems in a way, wouldn't you say, Karen, that Agnes is really the foundress of a lot of the sister houses, the daughter houses of San Damiano, the other monasteries. She's in some ways as on a kind of active organizational way, as opposed to being the vision and the original inspiration, the flame in the hearth, that she's almost as much a foundress of the Poor Clares as Clare was.
oh, absolutely. I think that's a wonderful way to put it. She carried the flame from San Damiano to many other monasteries of women throughout Europe.
And it's interesting that
One of the things that Agnes asked of Clare
yeah,
to comfort her, she said, was
some things from San
Damiano. Clare sent her own veil, and we know that because it's still preserved at Monticelli, where the Poor Clares are still living. But it was always understood that that veil got there because Agnes asked for it.
Mm-hmm.
So we're seeing growth, fast growth, amazing growth in those days,
mm-hmm.
Of the friars and the sisters.
One of the things that, as we come to the end of our time this evening, brings us even a year later now to that May gathering again, the Pentecost gathering, only now it's 1219. And now it is very apparent that there are difficulties among the men, among the friars. There are many who are looking for a change in the way of life, the rule, a sort of a mitigated form of life and rule. And Francis, during that gathering and in the presence of Cardinal Ugolino and all of the friars, delivers a very powerful excoriation, a denunciation of any attempt to change the way of life. And he is so vehement and so forceful at this that everybody is just so overwhelmed by the force of his rebuke that all talk about rewriting the rule ceases, at least temporarily for a while. But it's apparent that relationships are really being strained, spiritual relationships as well as bonds of affection, and everything is experiencing so much growth and so much transition that they're bound to be strains, even as there are in our own day. And as we look around at our own lives in the church, and we look around at the growth and the changes that are happening, we know that as things grow and change, the authenticity and the strength of relationships is very tested. And this was going on in the lives of Francis and Clare as well.
They had lost their great friend, Innocent III, who had granted Clare her privilege of poverty, who had given Francis his first commission to preach. Thinking of all of these friendships, we have Innocent, we have Clare and Agnes, we have Francis, Clare and Francis, and we have the first friars that had joined Francis and caught the fire directly from him. Part of the problem was there were so many friars, many of them never met Francis, and it was harder. But it was friendship on which this community, this new way of life was based.
Soul friends.
Soul friends. And so as the meditation song that we would like to share with you today is one written by Poor Clare's sister, Sister Brice O'Hare, an Irish nun. She took the words from Mechthild of Magdeburg, who was almost a contemporary of Clare, but in another part of the world. And these words were set to music by Sister Brice O'Hare. They are sung by Sister Marie Cox, and the name of the song is Come, My Own Dear Friend. So we have set it to music. We've set the words out so that you can follow it as you listen to it.
Come, my own dear friend, I, your God, await you, and my heart goes out to meet you. And though I am your God, I lose myself, I lose myself, I lose myself in you. Take and eat and drink, my body's only thine. And though I am your God, I long for you to be mine, that I might lose myself, lose myself, lose myself in you. So come, my own dear friend, drink this holy wine, and as you share with me my sacred life divine, I lose myself, I lose myself, I lose myself in you.
We want to conclude tonight, as we do each one of these presentations on Clare, by asking for God's blessing upon us and upon you, in thanksgiving for the time that you have spent with us.
We'd also like to mention that if you are as fascinated with Clare as we have been, that her entire biography is available from our website. It's one that I wrote while I was living as a poor Clare, first published in 1984, and then re-edited and put out again in 2011. I'm sorry, I'm living in the wrong century. And so that is available to anybody who is interested in it. We'll be glad to send you an autographed copy. Other resources are also available at the same site, which is our website, ravensbreadministries.com.
We want to thank you again for viewing. We want to thank you for being with us. And now we want to ask for God's blessing upon us as we conclude our time together. Let's just pull up
Picture of Clare.
so that we can have this. There we are. And let me just.
Paul's very busy here. He's the only one that can handle all this. Okay, dear.
May the Lord bless you and keep you.
May he show his face to you and be merciful to you.
May the Lord turn his countenance to you and give you peace.
May the Lord be with you always.
And wherever you are, may you be with him always. Again, thank you. God bless you, and good night.
God be with you.